Hi, Gil here, and today I'm going to cover primary mirror removal and reinstallation in a Dynamax telescope. So the plate's already out of this scope. I've covered corrector removal in another video. Take a 7/16 wrench, focus knob all the way to the right, hold the nut in place, turn the knob counterclockwise, off comes the focus knob. Take off the nut, 1/4 nylon washers, which hopefully you have there. I've already removed the C-ring lock from the bath tube. So at this point, the mirror will just slide out. And you can pull it straight forward. Again, keeping your hands off the mirror. And look for the 2 notches to get the mirror out of the cell, out of the tube. Fortunately, this scope did have nylon washers inside and out. I'll save those. There are some critical dimensions on this assembly. I'll cover those when we reassemble. I'm just taking the focus screw out. Don't have to do that, but I do want to give some dimensions for it. Usually these are pretty greasy. This just unscrews. It shouldn't be too tight, but it has to be tight enough to make sure the mirror isn't loose. One of the reasons Schmidt-Cassegrains go out of collimation is movement of the primary mirror when you reorient the scope. You definitely don't want that. This comes off, nice and gentle. They're big threads. Let's see what they did for washers on this. Fiber, 2 fiber. They're going to vary. Virtually every scope was different. At this point, the primary should come out. There we go. Unfortunately, they use that RTV shit. We'll talk about that too. Fortunately, you can still loosen the parts. That's a problem with the RTV type, is that you can't get to these threads anymore. And it kind of locks the orientation of the slide. This one looks like it was right anyway. So there in the front we have a cork washer and a fiber washer. On the back we had 2 fiber. You can try what you want on these telescopes. I personally prefer cork front and back. And I would use something like what they have on the front and the back of this telescope. To the point with the scope that I use the most, I bought a sheet of cork and cut myself washers for the front and the back of the primary. Let's cover some critical dimensions. As far as the focus screw goes, this particular sample is 2 inches long. I recommend if you're doing this yourself and making one of these, you go to a little longer, maybe 2 1/4, but this one is 2 and it works. The nut is glued at about 1 3/16. You need 1 3/16 of focus travel. That'll be the travel of the primary mirror on the telescope. This nut is glued with super glue. All we did was screw the nut on, glue it in place. Hopefully yours is still glued. If it's not, you do have to glue that yourself. Next critical dimension is the receptacle for the focus screw. We use 3/4 inch for this dimension. I have a contact who measured it at 19 millimeters, but we did put them in by hand with a ruler. This nut is fairly snug. You don't want the focus receptacle becoming loose, but there's not a lot of force to do that when the telescope's in use. So good and snug. Once you've got it measured properly, you could even put a drop of glue on there. We didn't do that at the factory. If you want to prevent it from tearing, when you tighten it, leave the focus screw in. At least that way there's something to give you a likelihood if you over torque this thing and break it. I have very few replacements. And the final critical dimension is the front of the mirror retainer to the front of the baffle slide. Measures at 2 inches. My contact again says, where is it? 54 millimeters. Again, we measured with a ruler. No micrometer, nothing like that. The focus travel of the scope does give a lot of room for error. So for the sake of argument, I'm going to leave this a hair over 2 inches. This has a fiber and cork washer. I'm going to leave that intact. That would be my recommendation, actually, to use that. sure it's sitting pretty flat. I'm not worried about cleaning the primary at all. Normally it's centered. When I was building these scopes, we centered it with tape. This one, because it has RTV, it's an earlier model. I'm just gonna get the primary back on, hopefully without a lot of torque to cause astigmatism. That seems pretty good. Now the problem is, can I attach the washers on the back? 2 fiber washers. I recommend 1 cork, 1 fiber. Sometimes you'll find rubber washers as well. Oh, quickly, these screws need to be snug. Don't strip them. It's easy to strip the heads of these screws, but if these screws are loose, you'll have trouble getting the focus screw back through the mirror cell when you reassemble. Hopefully yours are snug and you don't have to mess with them. And I'll just get this thing started and we'll see what happens. Ooh, not bad. That RTV actually gives it a little bit of cushion. Again, I'm making it snug enough from the rear, holding the dimension in the front, snug enough in the rear so a movement, rapid movement of the telescope, and I'm twisting while I do this, you don't feel the mirror move. And you want to get to that point where it's just between moving and not. And keep in mind, if you're ever going to ship this telescope, it's subject to a lot of vibration. That seems pretty good. Just so you understand what the whole thing looks like when it's assembled, here's the slide on the baffle tube. There's the assembly. This would be where the primary goes, which is removed for this. This is the retaining ring that holds, that acts as a front stop for the telescope, and that way you cannot drive the focuser so much that the focus screw disengages, freeing up the mirror and falling to the corrector plate, causing lots of damage. When you're putting this back on, especially when you have the mirror in your hand, it's a very snug fit. So you have to be careful to line it up correctly so it doesn't stick. It is easy. You have to use a little bit of finesse to keep the slide centered as you're installing the primary mirror. It is possible to get it out of line and have it stick, and you just have to be careful and carefully try to prevent that. In the installation, a lot of these are greased, and that's to take up the slack between the slide and the baffle tube. Your mileage may vary. So we're going to do that in the scope now. Now with the primary assembled, I want to get back into cell through the slots in the front cell. Trying to keep the focuser screw aligned with the hole so I can find it. Eyeballing it usually works. Again, keep your hands off the mirror. That really sucks when you put a fingerprint on it. There we go. When it's lined up, the focus screw will go right through. Snug. Nylon washers on the outside. 4/20 nut. 7/16 wrench. Tighten the knob, torque it against the nut just a bit. There's not a lot of force on it in use. See how it feels. Do not forget to put the retainer on. Second slot towards the back of the scope. If you were to forget that, and you have the telescope oriented down, and you disengage the focus screw, the mirror will fall out of the telescope, which is usually pretty bad for the corrector. That used to happen in shipping from time to time. Someone would, because it was the last step you do when you build one, it was easy to forget, and new users especially would forget to do this, and we'd get the telescope back with the mirror driven through the corrector plate destroyed. There you go. There's some things we didn't do in this video. We did not remove the rear cell. The reason for that is this is aligned with the front cell of the telescope. It's one of the early assembly steps. Too much to cover in this one video, but I will post that in a future date. So I'm going to put the corrector in, put my parts away. Good luck with your scope.